is absolutely the central question. Absolutely. Is it the shape or is it the content? But, of course, architects always tend to say, no, 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 it's not the shape, it's the content, it's not us, it's not us. You know, it's them, it's the people themselves, or it's the government, or it's the economy, or capitalism, it's not us. You know, so also you also have to be very critical about being critical on this, okay? Now, one of the big questions then was this enormous riot when thousands and thousands of North African and African boys, basically, started destroying their own neighborhoods, started fighting with the police, burning cars, etc., all over France. Was this just rioting? Was this the mob? Was this just like hooligans, craziness, just violence, just formless, shapeless violence? Or, and of course in France, this is a particularly interesting question, was it an uprising? Was it a rebellion? Was it righteous? Did they have a point? Were they fighting for something against someone? Were they defending something, or was it a revolution instead of just hooliganism and violence? And this is, of course, the fights in some years before that, in 1870, in the center of France, the Commune. So which was it? Was it a rebellion or just blind animal violence? The interesting thing is there's always been this relationship between, and this question, whether how you answer it or not, this question has always come up. And somehow there's always been this relationship between high-rise and violence. This, for example, is one of the earliest examples I could find. It's in an unexpected place. It's in Hong Kong. These are the fantastic, really beautifully planned modernist resettlement estates. After there was a big fire in the slum area of Hong Kong in 1950, the British decided to bring in the best modernist architects and to build a gigantic resettlement estate. And this resettlement estate erupted just a year after it was finished in violence against the British, following an incident with a mainland Chinese plane, etc., and then fights that took as a trigger a kind of political event, but then all of a sudden this entire council estate with tens of thousands of people erupted in violence, and then of course in old-fashioned colonial way, with colonial methods, this rebellion was put down. And here you have all the rebels at gunpoint praying for mercy from the British soldiers. So so this is 1956. This was when the Siam, when even before the big wave of high-rise building in France had really taken up, already there was this kind of connection between high-rises and violence. I'm not saying which connection. Another very famous example, a couple of years later, this is in a huge high-rise complex in St. Louis, Missouri, the Pruitt-Ego complex built by Yamasaki, the unfortunate architect who also designed the World Trade Center in New York. And this is his idea of beautiful streets in the air where where the black lower and middle classes could live together in a very modern way, having been freed from the slums and put into these magnificent towers and slabs with a great view of the city. A little later, this is what these streets in the air had degenerated into. The lifts no longer worked. Only the poor and the unemployed and the criminal stayed in the flats. and these objects, these gigantic objects, had to be demolished very soon. Here you see them being demolished. So is there a kind of genetic disposal for absolute failure in modernist public housing architecture? That is the question that was answered with an absolute yes by a lot of critics, historians, architects in 1970, when the Pruitt ego complex was in its entirety demolished, blown up. And at that time, in France, they were still building this stuff. And in Holland, by the way, in the early 70s. Now, but if you look at a completely different way, if you just look at when violence erupts in cities, let us look then also just the very last time that we had some violence, always in Dutch portions, in our cities. It was the riots between Moroccan kids and kids from the Molukken in Culemborg, of all places. So here you see all the trappings of urban violence. You see these concrete bumps, I think they call them. You see the night view. You see the empty streets. You see the screaming alarmist headlines in the tabloid newspapers. You see everything there. But what you also see is kind of small scale, low rise, private housing. You know, so does this then also cause violence? Should we also demolish all houses that look like this? Does a house with a roof and a door on the street, does that also produce violence? Maybe there is no connection between the scale and the form and the violence. Maybe not. But anyway, as you can also see here, Ruilwijken, which means riot neighborhoods, get money for innovation, for renovation. So that is also always a big part of the story, the constant struggle of the politics with areas that have violence, that have poverty, that have alienation, that have unhappy people voting for the wrong parties, etc. So what do you do with these areas? And then it seems that there's always this endless injection of policy, of money, of subsidies, etc. And it never seems to work. So what are the kind of causes? What are the real causes for violence and crime in cities? It all depends on your point of view. It all depends on your own political or even professional background. There is a whole school of kind of, you could say, progressive, left-wing critics and researchers, urban critics, urban researchers, that say no wonder that there is violence in these areas because they are segregated, they are far away, they are the result of top-down power, they are the result of a much too powerful, much too technocratic government just pushing people away and locking them up in these big alienating boxes that treat people like cattle and that treat people like numbers, and that is the reason that these people will revolt, because they do not have, as some people say, the right to the city. They do not own it. It's a kind of Marxist idea that they have no control over the means of production or the means of space, so they get alienated and then boom. That's basically Jane Jacobs. So areas, the city should be more finely grained, small-scaled, much more the result of what people want, what people do, not the result of what bureaucrats or planners do. And then there's a kind of a more radical a version of this story with people like Mike Davis, the famous Californian radical Marxist urban critic, who says that there's even that cities are more and more the victim of conscious and planned exploitation by the forces of capital, the forces of fear, the forces of violence, to turn cities into you know, kind of dystopian nightmares with tiny little islands of luxury and safety for the super rich. So there's a kind of apocalyptic version to this story too. So this is what the left wing, the lefties think. So this is what the city might turn into, this kind of an ecology of fear, with neighborhood watches, gated communities, slums, heavily policed condominiums, etc. Then there is another stream, another political, which is funnily enough, overlaps partly with the last one, but comes from a completely different political standpoint. It's, you could say, the conservative, neoliberal, more right-wing position, which says, no wonder that violence, poverty, and crime erupts in these areas, because they are the ultimate result of the big government, of the welfare state, of the government thinking that they can take care of everyone and everything, of the government taking away all responsibility from the people themselves, taking away all incentive for the people to take care of their own lives, to do what's best for them, to take care of their children, to make sure that their children behave on the street, to make sure that they themselves get a job, to take responsibility for when they drink too much, are too lazy, etc. So the public housing was, of course, indeed a project that wanted to give a whole package to the people, that wanted to provide them with good housing, that wanted to provide them with perfect schools, with public spaces, etc. It also offered rent control so that the people did not have to pay too much for the city, for their apartment. It offered good housing for everyone, notwithstanding their income level. So indeed, the public housing, the high-rise estates and the public housing are very much connected, and are indeed very much connected to this enormous post-war project of the welfare state that has created the Netherlands that we know or knew, and that has created the Britain that we know or knew, that has created more of the United States than the United States would want to admit. It's this enormous construction of this enormous state that is capable of managing nearly everything and providing us with an enormous high standard of facilities, housing, healthcare, education, etc. So the public housing exploding in violence can also be seen, has also been seen by the more conservative political thinkers as a sign that this construction by the state of society has gone too far and is breaking down. So, for example, conservative critics like Christopher Caldwell in the New York Times, he writes revolting high-rises. Revolting means both that they revolt, so that they fight, but revolting also means disgusting in English. There's a double meaning to this word. So, and he traces back, he walks through these areas, and he writes about how these young North African and African boys have been left to run wild, not controlled by their schools or by the police or even by their parents, that they have an absolute lack of morality, an absolute lack of horizon, an absolute lack of ambition, that at the same time the government has always planned these areas and also treated these areas as